Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, 21a of Maseches Kiddushin, and we're starting from the top line of this page of Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. We are in the middle of a discussion about redeeming slaves, redeeming fields, redeeming houses, all these kinds of things, and specifically the Gemara had been dealing with a question about redeeming Batei Arei Choma, houses in walled cities, and the question of whether it was possible to redeem it in parts, if you could redeem one part at a time, or it had to be redeemed all together. Could you be golet lachatzai? Can you redeem it in part? And the Gemara actually ended up with a machlokes Tanayim between the Rabbanan and Reb Shimon, a dispute between the Tanaim of the rabbis and Reb Shimon. And basically, what the dispute boiled down to was that, according to Reb Shimon, we are doresh taima dekra. According to Reb Shimon, when we see a halacha, we figure out the reason for it, and we can apply that reason to other situations. So Reb Shimon was faced with the following halacha, or discrepancy in two halachos. On the one hand, the halacha is that if a person sells their stei achuza, their field of inheritance that belongs, to their family, all the way back to the division of the land of Israel, so their stei achuza, their ancestral land, the halacha is that when you sell that field, you are not allowed to redeem it for the first 2 years. After 2 years, you're allowed to redeem it. If you don't redeem it, you get it back at Yovel. In addition to that, you are not allowed to redeem it in part. When you redeem it, you have to redeem it in total. On the other hand, if a person is makdish a field, if a person consecrates a field to the Beis HaMikdash, so then they are allowed to redeem it up until Yovel, but assuming that the treasurer of the temple has not sold it, as long as it's still in the hands of the treasurer, a person can redeem it. But if Yovel comes along, one may not redeem it. Then it goes to the Kohanim, it's now out of your hands. So it's possible for an ancestral field to leave the family if it was consecrated to the Beis HaMikdash and not redeemed before Yovel. Now, on the other hand, we find that in regards to a field that was consecrated, you could redeem it in part. You don't have to redeem it all at once. You could be goel lachatzayim, and that's effective. So therefore, Reb Shimon said, I want to understand why. Why is it that when it comes to a field that you sell, you may not redeem it in part, but you also can't borrow to redeem it, by the way. And a field that you consecrate, you could borrow money to redeem it, and you can redeem it in part. And he said, I think that it has to do with the fact of whether you will get it back anyways at Yovel. The field that you get, basically the Torah wants fields and houses to remain within the family, as much, to a certain extent. So therefore, when it came to a field that you sold, that you get back at Yovel, so then that field, since you get it back at Yovel anyways, we don't have to make it so easy to redeem in the meanwhile, and that's why the Torah said that you may not borrow money to redeem it, you can't redeem it in part either. As opposed to a field that you consecrate, that you dedicate, that you're makdish to the Beis HaMikdash, so then if you don't redeem it by Yovel, you're not going to get it back. So the Torah actually made it a little bit easier to redeem it before, and said you're allowed to borrow money, and you can also redeem it in parts. Therefore, says Reb Shimon, let's take that idea and apply it to Batei Arei Choma, to houses in walled cities. A house in a walled city, if you sell a house in a walled city, you have 1 year to redeem it. If you don't redeem it, you lose it. You're not going to get it back, unless you buy it back, but you can't forcibly redeem it. Therefore, since you would lose that, says Reb Shimon, the Torah makes it easier to redeem it. And Reb Shimon says when it comes to Batei Arei Choma, when it comes to houses in walled cities, you are allowed to borrow money to redeem it, and you're allowed to redeem it in part. The Rabbanan, they're not doresh taima dekra. They don't take the reasoning and apply it to other situations. So they maintain there's no source for the idea that and also there's reason to say not, actually, that we find that in general, the ability of a person when redeeming Batarei Choma is weakened, because he's going to lose it in the end, right? So he says, therefore, say the Rabbanan, the fact that you won't be able to redeem it after the 1 year, too bad, and we're not going to make it easier for you to redeem it. They hold there's no source for that, and they maintain that you cannot borrow money to redeem it, and you cannot redeem it in part. Okay, so that brings us to the top line of our Gemara. Quite an introduction. We really are going to have to give more of a refresher soon. But the top line says, Tani Chada, one Tana Tat, Love V'goel Achatzayim. One Tana thought, and this is talking about selling a house in a walled city, in Batei Ari Choma, that you could borrow to redeem it, and you can redeem it in part. V'tan Yidach, and we have another brisa that says the opposite. It says, Ein lo v'goel achatzayim. You cannot borrow and redeem it, and you cannot redeem it in part. So it seems to be a contradiction. One brisa says the house in a walled city you could borrow to redeem it, and you could redeem it in part. The other one says you can't. So the Gemara says, Lo kashya. It's not a contradiction, it's just a machlokas. It's a dispute. Harabanan, Harab Shimon. The one that says that you're allowed to, that's the opinion of the Rabbanan. The one that says you're not allowed to, that's the opinion of the Rabbanan. The one that says you are allowed to borrow and you could redeem in part, that's the opinion of Reb Shimon. Okay, now the opinion of the Rabbanan was expressed in a brisa. We'd have to kind of review that brisa before we can see the next lines of the Gemara. The brisa was at the beginning of Chaf Amud Beis of 20b, and the brisa, I think I'll just read it. It starts from it's actually quite a long brisa. So the brisa starts about, let's count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 14 lines from the bottom, if you have the page in front of you. If not, you can just listen. So the brisa says that there's a pasuk in Ga'ol Yigael, which teaches me, it means you can surely redeem. That teaches me that that's how I know that a makdish, someone who consecrates a field, that's the source that he can surely redeem it. So he could borrow money to redeem it. He could redeem it in parts. That's the source for it. And the whole brisa is going through why I need a pasuk for this. Why would I think that he could not redeem it in part, or that he couldn't borrow money? So the reason I would think that is because I would think it should be similar to selling a field. When you sell a field, we said earlier, you can't borrow and you can't redeem it in part. And that's learned out from a pasuk. So I would have thought that sanctifying is similar to that. Now, why would I have thought that? Where would that come from? So the brisa says you can go, oh, you go now. If you'll sorry, it's not that. We don't have to go back to that brisa. My apologies. We have to go 7 lines from the bottom, where it says esvei. The first word on the line is esvei. This is the opinion of the Rabbanim. Im ga'ol yigael, you shall surely redeem it. Melamed shelo v'gol chatzayim, which teaches me that you can borrow to redeem and you can redeem in part. Sheyachol, because I might have said, v'alodinu, I would have said it's a kav v'chomer. We can learn out logically that you can't. Uma mocher sat steachuzeh. When it comes to someone who sells an ancestral field, Sheyafa kocho, that we find the Torah grants him greater power. So much power that if Yovel comes and he didn't redeem it, he gets it back. So Yovel comes back to him at Yovel. And yet the Torah weakened him and said that he cannot borrow to redeem and cannot redeem in part. So maktish, so when it comes to someone who sanctifies a field, shehura kocho, that we find that the Torah gives him less power. That what? Shem yigia Yovel v'lo nigola yotzal hakohanim b'Yovel. If Yovel comes, and he never redeemed it, the one who sanctified it, consecrated it, he loses it. It goes to the Kohanim. So we see that he's weakened. So eino din shehura kocho. So shouldn't we say all the more so that he should be weakened in this regard too? That he shouldn't be able to borrow to redeem, and he shouldn't be able to redeem in part. So that's the Kal V'chomer, which would teach me that he cannot redeem in part, and that's why I would need a pasuk to tell me that he could. That's what the Brisa is saying. Says the Brisa, but would I really think that? Would I really make that Kal V'chomer? There's a problem with that Kal V'chomer. In a certain sense, though, that Kal V'chomer assumes that there's more power to the one who sells his field in terms of getting it back than the one who consecrates it. But in a certain regard, he's actually weakened. What's that? He's weakened and you can't redeem it right away. When you sell a field, you can't redeem it in the first 2 years. You have to wait till after that. Tomar b'maktish, as opposed to when you consecrate a field, sheyafe kochel igal miyad. That you have more power in that you could redeem it right away. So he actually has more power in a certain sense in terms of getting it back. So maybe I wouldn't learn from the one who sells the field to the one who consecrates a field that you can't redeem it in part. I wouldn't learn that, and therefore I don't need a pasuk to teach me otherwise. So the Gemara says, the Brisa says, Mocher bais batei arichoma yochiach. What refutes that is the halacha of somebody who sells a house in a walled city. Batei arichoma, that yafe kochel igal miyad, he could redeem right away. He could redeem within the first year. Yes, that's the only time he could redeem it, in the first year. So you can redeem it right away, and yet, this is the opinion of the Rabbanan, ve'ein lo ve'goa ve'goa chatzayim. And yet you can't borrow to redeem, and you can't redeem in part. So the Rabbanan say that, so what do we see? We see that even though you can redeem right away, that type of koach, that type of power, doesn't influence whether you should be able, we don't say, oh, if you could do that, then you must be able to do this. We don't say if you could redeem right away, you must be able to redeem in part, because we see that's not true when it comes to the houses in walled cities. So that won't be true either when it comes to makdish, when it comes to consecrating. We're not going to say, oh, just because he could redeem it right away, it must be that he could also redeem in part. Because those two things aren't connected, we see. And that's why I need a pasuk to tell me. That's why we need the verse, Yigael, to teach me he shall surely redeem, that when it comes to a makdish, someone who consecrates his field, he's allowed to borrow to redeem it, he's allowed to redeem it in part. So that brings us back to our Gemara, 4 lines down on Chaf Aleph Amar Aleph. It says, Amar le Rav Acha brei de Rava le Rav Ashi. Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, Ikul nifrach. But I can refute this Kal V'chomer still, or this point that we just made, and say, Ma lemocher bayis bebatei arichoma shekin hura kochel ligal le'olam. The one who sells his field in a walled city, a mocher bayis and batei arichoma, he is weakened in another regard, and maybe that's why he can't redeem, and he can't redeem in part, and he can't borrow to redeem. In what way is he weakened? Because he can't be goel le'olam. He once that 1 year passes, he can never redeem it. He doesn't have even till Yovel. He doesn't have anything. And once if you sell a house in a walled city, you have 1 year to redeem it. If you miss that 1 year, that's it. It belongs to the buyer. You could buy it back, but you can't forcibly redeem it. Tomar b'makdish, as opposed to someone who consecrates a field, sheyafe kochel ligal le'olam. He's stronger because he could redeem it forever. We don't mean forever, really. We mean up till Yovel, he could still redeem it. So he has he's stronger in a certain sense. And so back to our sort of, this back and forth, we wanted to show from the fact that that someone who sells a house in a walled city, batei arichoma, we said if he can redeem right away, as soon as he sells it, which is yafe kochel, that's a power that he has, and yet he can't borrow to redeem it, he can't redeem it in part. So we see the fact that you can redeem right away isn't a power, isn't something that helps you, that's connected to your ability, to the ability to be able to redeem it in part. So we're saying back, well, maybe really it is, and maybe he can't redeem in part for a different reason. We see that he's weaker in a certain sense, because he also, once he misses that 1 year, he can't redeem it at all. As opposed to someone who was makdish their field, they consecrated their field, they have a bit more power because they can redeem all the way up till Yovel. So just like they have more power for that, maybe I should say they have more power for redeeming in part and borrowing money to redeem. And I don't need a pasuk to teach me that. So the Gemara says, Amar li Rav Acha Saba li Rav Ashi. So Rav Acha Saba said to Rav Ashi, Mishum Dikul Meimar, Nihader Dina. Tesu Matzad. You know why I still need the pasuk? Because I can. Nihader Dina means like return the logic. We can take this logic in circle and create a matzad, a comparison out of it. And that works as follows. We'll say back, basically, that mocher ste'achuza yochiach, that the case of selling an ancestral field, will refute sheyafe kocho ligal le'olam, because he has the power, he can redeem forever all the way up till Yovel, and actually beyond. Well, he gets it back at Yovel, but he has the power to redeem all the way up till Yovel. If you sell a field, you can't redeem it in the first 2 years, but you can redeem it after that all the way up till Yovel. Yet he can't borrow to redeem, and he can't redeem in part. So we see the ability to redeem all the way up till Yovel doesn't really influence your ability to redeem in part, because he could redeem it all the way up till Yovel, and he can't redeem it in part. So you'll say back, well, yeah, but one who sells their ancestral field is weaker because he can't redeem right away. So you'll say, yeah, but mocher bais v'vatei arichoma yochiach. But someone who sells a field in a walled city, that will refute that, because he could redeem right away, and that doesn't help him. Be able to redeem in part. The chazar hadin, and then we're basically going to take all this logic in circles, and we'll say lo rizeh k'rizeh. This strength is not like this strength. This one's not like this one. We have these two things. We have selling a ste'achuzah, an ancestral field, and we have this case of selling a house in a walled city. You have selling an ancestral field, ste'achuzah, and we have batei arichoma, selling a house in a walled city. Both of these things we know, the Rabbanan hold, you cannot borrow money to redeem, and you can't redeem it in part. Now each one has a strength and a weakness. Each one, the strength of the ancestral field is that you get it back at Yovel, and you have all the way till Yovel to redeem it. But it has a weakness that you can't redeem it right away. You have to wait. On the other hand, the house in the walled city is the opposite. That one, you have the strength that you can redeem it right away, but once you miss that, you can no longer redeem it. So it has a weakness too. So they both have opposite strengths and weaknesses, and neither seems to be contributing. Neither seems to be the influencer or the indicator that it should be of why it can't be redeemed in part and why you can't borrow money to redeem it. So basically, it must not be about any of those things. That's what the Gemara is saying. Lo rizeh k'rizeh. This one's strength is not this type is not like this type, and this one's not like that. Hatzad hashava shebahem. But what's the unifying part of them? What's equal about them? Shenigalin. That they both are things that you redeem. You can redeem a ste'achuzah, you can redeem a ancestral field, and you can redeem a house in a walled city within the first year. And yet, during that, whenever that time of redemption is, you're not allowed to borrow to redeem, and you also can't redeem in part. So I'll say, because the whole point here is to try to figure out the story with the case where you consecrate the field. You don't sell it, but you consecrate it. So afani avi maktish. So let me learn from there to the person who consecrated their field. Shenigal, it's also something that you redeem. So we should say, that you should not be able to borrow and redeem, and you should not be able to redeem it part way. And that matzad seems to work. That's what we should say, and that's why we need a pasuk to teach me not to say that. That's why we need the pasuk, Yigael, you shall surely redeem it, that when it comes to consecrating a field, you are allowed to redeem it in part, and you are allowed to borrow to redeem it. Okay, but we're not quite done yet. So Amar Le Mar Zutra Breder Mari Ravina. Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Mari, said to Ravina, but Ikol Mifrach, but you can still ask a question. Ma, on this whole Ma'atzad, Ma'atzad Hashava Shebahen Sheking Hura Kocham Ligal B'Shana Shniya. You're trying to say that the case of selling a field and the case of selling a house in a walled city are, for all intents and purposes, the same as sanctifying a field. Because there are some differences, but those differences, aren't across the board, and they don't seem to make a difference. That was the whole lo rizeh rizeh, that they have differences, but those don't seem to affect anything. But otherwise, they're the same as consecrating a field. And that's why we should be able to learn to consecrating the field. Now the Gemara is saying, well, actually, there's still a difference. Because those two cases, they're weakened that they can't be redeemed in the second year. Meaning what? When you sell a field, so you are not allowed to redeem it the first 2 years. You can't redeem it the first year, you can't redeem it the second year. After that, you could redeem it. When you sell a house in a walled city, you may not redeem it the first year. Sorry, you only have the first year to redeem it. You cannot redeem it the second year. So that second year is actually a unifying part, because neither of them can you redeem in the second year. The field that you sell, you cannot redeem neither the first or the second year, but you can't redeem it the second year. After that, you could redeem it. The house that you sell in the walled city, you can only redeem it the first year, but you can't redeem it the second year, or the third year and fourth year. But what unites them is neither of them you can redeem in the second year. Tamar b'makdish, as opposed to one who consecrates his field to hektish, sheyafe kocho ligal b'shana shniya, that he is strengthened, that he could redeem it in the second year. So maybe you'll say those things, the house in the walled city, and when you sell a field, that's where you can't borrow money to redeem it, and you can't redeem it in part. But we find sort of a unifying factor that they're weaker, that neither of them could be redeemed in the second year. As opposed to makdish, when you consecrate a field, you could redeem it in the second year. So it has more of a koch, has more of a power. And maybe that should give it, maybe you shouldn't be able to learn from the other ones to this one. And you should continue to assume, even without a pasuk, that you could redeem it in part and that you can borrow to redeem it. And we're back to the question, so then why do I need a pasuk? So Amar le Ravina, so Ravina said, Mishum de'ikol meimar, because you can say, Eved ivri hanimkar le'ovid kochavim yochiach. Then we see that the ability to redeem in the second year doesn't affect, is not connected, is not an indicator of the ability to borrow to redeem or the ability to redeem in part. We see that from a Jewish slave who was sold to a non-Jew. He could be redeemed in the second year. There's no time he could be redeemed right away, and including the second year. And yet, but when it comes to a Jewish slave who was sold to a non-Jew, you cannot borrow to redeem it. There also it says v'siga yado, that there has to be enough money to redeem. You can't borrow to redeem. And also v'gal chatzayin, you can't be gal chatzayin, you can't redeem in part. That we learned, I think last week or the week before, that just like you can't, a Jewish slave can't be sold in part, he also can't be redeemed in part. And so we see from the Eved Ivri, Hanimkar Ovid Kochavim, a Jewish slave who was sold to a non-Jew, we see that the ability to redeem in the second year is not an indicator of the ability to redeem in part, or borrow to redeem. And therefore, that shouldn't make a difference. That could kind of enter this whole circle of logic and say that's not an indicator. And so what equates all these things that they're redeemed, and you can't borrow to redeem, and you can't redeem in part. So I would think that the same is true when you consecrate a field. That's why I have a pasuk, Im Gol Yigalel, to teach me otherwise, that when it comes to consecrating a field, you are allowed to borrow to redeem, and you are allowed to redeem it in parts. Okay. Ba'amine Rav Huna bar Chinana me Rav Sheshes. Rav Huna, the son of Chinana, asked Rav Sheshes, Hamocher bayis bebate arechoma. One who sells a field in a walled city, nigal lekrovim or ein nigal lekrovim, can it be redeemed by relatives or not? So, Steachuza, an ancestral field, as we're about to see, is redeemed by relatives. Can be, must be, we'll see, there's a question about that. It certainly can be redeemed by relatives, by others. What about a house in a walled city? If I sell a house in a walled city, and I have 1 year to redeem it, do I have to be the one to redeem it, or could relatives also redeem it? That was Rav Huna's question to Rav Sheshes. And what was the question based on? The following. Do we say Geulaso Misteachuza Gamar? Do we learn a Gezerah Shava? Do we learn to compare Batei Arechoma? We have this Gezerah Shava. The question is, to what extent does it apply? So does this Gezerah Shava apply? And do we say that it says Geulaso, its redemption, here and there? It says it by houses in walled cities, and it says it by ancestral fields. And I'll say Masteachuza in a Nigalas l'chatzayin, just like a housing ancestral field, not a house, a Steachuza, an ancestral field, cannot be redeemed in part. Vinigalas l'krovin, but it could be redeemed by relatives. So I'll say Afhainami. So a house in a walled city, the same thing. A Nigal l'chatzayin, it can't be redeemed in part. That's learned from the Gezerah Shava. Vinigal l'krovin. And it could be redeemed by relatives. Do we include the ability to redeem by relatives in the comparison and say that we can learn from there to here that Batei Arechoma, houses in walled cities, can also be redeemed by relatives? O Dilmar, maybe Kiksiva Geula B'chatzayin Hu D'chsev B'krovin Lo Ksiv. Or do we say that when we say the word Geula, so it's redemption, and we make a Gezerah Shava, it was only to teach me that you are not allowed to sell in part? But it doesn't also teach me to compare it with regards to this point of Krovin, of the ability for relatives to redeem it. That was the question Rav Huna posed to Rav Sheshes, and Amar Le, he said to him, Eino Nigo, it can't be redeemed by Krovin, it can't be redeemed by relatives. The Gezerah Shava doesn't apply to this, we don't compare them in this regard. A Steachuza, an ancestral field, can be redeemed by relatives, but a house in a walled city cannot be redeemed by relatives. The owner, the seller of the house, has to be the one to redeem it. Says the Gemara Esvei. We have a contradiction to this from a Brisa. It says in the Brisa, it quotes a pasuk, it says, in all your ancestral lands, b'chol eretz achuzaschem geula titnu la'aretz. You should have redemption in the land. So the Gemara says that this pasuk is l'rabos batim ve'eved ivri. It's coming to include houses and a Jewish slave. So we have, I think this is in the context of selling fields, I believe, but it's kind of an extra verse. It says, in all your lands you should have redemption. What's it coming to add? What's it coming to include? So it's coming to include not only redeeming fields, but redeeming houses and redeeming Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave. Ma'irav Batei Arechoma. Now isn't it, which kind of houses are we talking about? Aren't we talking about houses in walled cities? And what it will be teaching me is that we should that redeeming houses in walled cities should be similar to redeeming fields, and you could redeem it with relatives. Relatives could redeem it. That would be a question on Rav Sheshes. So he said, no, lo, batei chatzerim. It's talking about houses in courtyards, in other words, in non-walled cities. Regular cities, regular houses, not houses in walled cities. The Gemara says, batei chatzerim b'hed yaksibu. I don't need this pasuk to teach me that relatives can redeem houses in non-walled cities. That's explicit. It says in the pasuk that, it says at the beginning of this pasuk, reads, Uvatei hachatzerim asher ein lahem choma asaviv. They're houses and courtyards that don't have a wall around them. Al stei artzi chashev. They should be considered like fields. That's what we quote now. Al stei artzi chashev. They should be considered like fields. And the same halachos of the fields apply to those houses. So I have another pasuk that teaches me that houses in non-walled cities are like fields and that they can be redeemed by relatives. So what's this first pasuk? B'chol eretz achuzaschem gula titnu la'aretz. That in all your lands there should be redemption. that must be coming to teach me about houses in walled cities. So the Gemara says, no. You know why there's two verses with regards to houses in non-walled cities? Hahula kova chova. That's coming to establish it as an obligation. I guess what it's saying is the first pasuk tells me that you are allowed to redeem it. Relatives are allowed to redeem it. The second one adds, and it's an obligation on them. V'aliba de Rabbi Eliezer. This will be going with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanya we learned in a brisa. The pasuk says that when your brother becomes poor and he sells his land, so then ubagu ala karov love, his relative who's close to him should come. V'ga'al, this is what we quote now, V'ga'al eis mimkar achiv. And he should redeem the sale of his brother. That which his brother sold, he should redeem. Rishus, so the Brisa says that is not an obligation, it's a rishus, it's an option. This is the first opinion of the Brisa. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Ata omer rishus eino ela chova. Now he says, you're telling me it's an option. It's not an obligation. Maybe it's an obligation. Talmud Lomar, that's why you know how we know it's not an obligation? From another pasuk. Because another pasuk says, V'ish ki lo yeh lo goel. That if there's a man who has no redeemer, asks the Gemara, V'chi yesh adam b'Yisrael she'en lo goelim, could there be a Jew who doesn't have any redeemer? Just go back. You'll find, if you don't have a first cousin, an uncle or first cousin, it could be a second cousin or a third cousin. If you go back up the family tree far enough, everybody has a relative. So what's it talking about when it says there's no redeemer? It must be that he has one, but he doesn't want to. He's allowed to not. Divir Rabbi Yoshua, sorry, not Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Yoshua's opinion. This is Rabbi Yoshua's opinion that there could be a case where there's no redeemer, and what is that? It's if nobody wants to, because they have the option. And so when the Torah says that a relative will redeem, it means that a relative is allowed to redeem. Rabbi Eliezer says, V'ga'al eis mimkar achiv chova. Rabbi Eliezer says, no. When it says that he should redeem his brother's sale, that's an obligation. Ata omer chova oeno el rishus. Now you're telling me it's an obligation, he says. Maybe it's only an option, maybe it's optional. Talmud Lomar, that's why the Torah says, B'chol geula titnu. This is the first verse that we started with, that it really says, B'chol eretz achuzaschem geula titnu, that in all your lands you should give redemption. Hakasav kavu chova, that's to make it into an obligation. So actually the order is, the first pasuk that we started with is what makes it into an obligation. This other pasuk is adding to that the other pasuk is saying it's an option, and then the second pasuk, which was our first pasuk, now tells us that it is an obligation. So the Gemara continues, it says, Amri le Rabbanan le Rav Ashi. The Rabbanan said to Rav Ashi, V'amri le Ravina le Rav Ashi, and some say that it was Ravina who said to Rav Ashi, Bishlam alamanda amar le Rabos bate arichoma. I understand, according to the opinion, that the words B'chol eretz achuzaschem was coming to include walled, bate arichoma was coming to include houses in walled cities. So what we had started with here was this, what I was referring to as the first pasuk. So earlier we brought the brisa, and the brisa had said, again, the Gemara asked a question, Rav Huna asked Rav Sheshes, if you sell a house in a walled city, can relatives redeem it? Rav Sheshes said, no. The Gemara had a brisa that said, it quoted this pasuk, B'chol eretz achuzaschem geula titnu la'aretz, or B'chol geula titnu, this is how it's quoted in the Gemara, that in all the lands they should give redemption. What was that coming to add? What was that coming to include? So it said in the brisa it's coming to include houses. What kind of houses? So we said it's coming to include houses in walled. We thought maybe it's coming to include houses in walled cities, and that was a question on Rav Sheshes. And the Gemara said no, it's coming to include houses in non-walled cities. we thought it was coming to include houses in walled cities, which would indicate that they could be redeemed by relatives. And said, no, those can't be redeemed by relatives. Houses in non-walled cities could be redeemed by relatives. So now the Gemara says, I understand if that pasuk was coming to teach me that to include houses in walled cities, so then it makes sense. Hainu d'chsiv b'chol. That makes sense that it says u'b'chol eretz achuzaskan, in all the land, even in what's all the land, even in the walled cities. But if it's only coming to include houses in non-walled cities, which generally are comparable anyways to fields. My bechol. What's the bechol? What's it? Why does it say in all? In all the land seems to say all types of houses, all types should be able to be redeemed by relatives. So the Gemara actually says Kashya. That's a good question, and we're left with the question on Rav Sheshes, I suppose. Rav Sheshes said that relatives cannot redeem houses in walled cities. The Brisa said that B'chol Eretz Achuzaschem Titnu Geula comes to include houses, that they could be redeemed by relatives. What kind of houses? We're now saying it sounds like it should be all houses, because it says B'chol in all. So that is left as a question on Rav Sheshes. Okay, Esvei Abaye. Abaye asked another question from a Brisa. The Brisa says, Ma Talmud Lomar Yigolenu Gimel Pamim. In the context of an Eved Ivri, of a Jewish slave who was sold to a non-Jew, we find that over the course of 2 verses that it says the word Yigolenu, he should redeem or he should be redeemed. It says it 3 times. Gimel Pamim says it 3 times. What's that coming to teach me? L'rabos kol ha'geulos shenigalos keseder hazeh. It's to teach you that all redemptions can be redeemed like this. Meaning the same way a Jewish slave who sold to a non-Jew could be redeemed, so too all redemptions work that way. So, by the way, a Jew who was sold to a non-Jew can be redeemed by relatives. So, Ma'ala Bati Arichama V'Evri Ivri. Isn't it coming to say that even houses in walled cities could be redeemed by relatives? We learn all redemptions are the same from the Jewish slave, Eved Ivri, Animkar Lovid Kochavim, was sold to a non-Jew. Just like he could be redeemed by relatives, so too a house in a walled city, and so too an Eved Ivri, a regular Jew who was sold to a Jewish slave who was sold to a Jew. So the Gemara says, well, Bate Chatzerim Usteachuz. You know where it's coming to include? Not those things. It's coming to include houses in courtyards and fields, ancestral fields, that those can be redeemed by relatives. Says the Gemara, we know that already. But those are explicit, that relatives can redeem houses in courtyards, in non-walled cities, and ancestral fields. It says, that it says it explicitly by a field, and we learn the pasuk says by houses in non-walled cities that it should be like a field. So we know that you can redeem them, that relatives can redeem them. Says the Gemara, you know what this is teaching me? Additionally, what this is adding is Kita Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. It's adding what Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, L'karav Karav Kodem. What it's teaching me is that the closest relatives should come first. The closest relatives have first obligation to redeem. That's what he said in another context. And Hachanami, so here too, it's coming to teach me L'karav Karav Kodem. It's coming to teach me that also for houses in non-walled cities and ancestral fields, the closest relative comes first. Because in the context of the fields, it didn't list like the relatives. It just said in general that relatives should redeem it, I believe. As opposed to, when it came to a Jewish slave who was sold to a non-Jew, it says, Dodo, first it said his uncle, then Ben Dodo, his cousin, or any other relative. So then it's first lists the close relatives, followed by it really first lists his brother, then his uncle. So it goes in order of the closeness of the relatives. So that's how it goes in general. Just like that's true by Jewish slave who's sold to a non-Jew. That's how it is for a field, a steachuza, an ancestral field, or for a house in a non-walled city. In what context did Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak give this teaching? And the following, because they asked them, Eved Ivri hanimker l'Yisrael. What about an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave who's sold to a Jew? Nigol l'krovim or engon nigol l'krovim? Can he be redeemed by relatives or not? And we've spoken about fields, we've spoken about houses in walled cities, non-walled cities, we've spoken about a Jew who sold to a non-Jew. What about a Jew who sold to a Jew? Can he be redeemed by relatives? So the Gemara says, Aliba de Rabbi lo tibaylach. According to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, we don't have a question that he can't. Because it's explicit in the Brisa. De Amar, he said, Mishe'eno nigol be'ele, nigol b'sheish. In the context of a Kal V'chomer, Rabbi used the following expression, the following words. He said, one who can't be redeemed by relatives, be'ele means the relatives, should be able to redeem after 6 years. So the Gemara, the Brisa dealt with what point he was trying to make, but in making that point, he said the words that and he was talking about a regular Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave sold to a Jew, and he said if he can't be redeemed by his relatives, he should be able to go out after 6 years. So we see though that he holds he can't be redeemed by his relatives. Amalo Mifrik, so we see he can't be redeemed. So there's no question according to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. But where we do have a question is according to the Rabbanan who don't say that. What do they hold? What do they hold? Can a Jewish slave sold to a Jew be redeemed by relatives? Yelfinan sachir. Do they learn Gzeira Shava to compare the word sachir, worker? It says worker by a Jewish slave sold to a Jew. And it says worker by a Jewish slave sold to a non-Jew. And just like a Jewish slave sold to a non-Jew could be redeemed by relatives, so to a Jewish slave sold to a Jew. And according to that, v'lo darshi yigolenu, and according to that, he wouldn't have a exclusion from the word yigolenu. Yigolenu could be an exclusion. Here it should be redeemed, but not elsewhere. By relatives, by a Jewish slave sold to a non-Jew, relatives redeem, but not by a Jewish slave sold to a Jew. Rather, a Jewish slave sold to a Jew also could be redeemed by relatives. Dilmor, maybe he does have that exclusion, that we should learn out that only in the context of a Jewish slave sold to a non-Jew can the relatives redeem, but not in a case of a Jewish slave sold to a Jew. So what's the story? Can you be redeemed by relatives or not? So the Gemara says, Tashma, come and listen to the Brisa, that the same pasuk we keep coming back to. In all the lands, you should give redemption. What does that come to include? It comes to include houses. We already dealt with what kind of houses. We went back and forth. It wasn't so clear what kind of houses. Now, and Eved Ivri. What kind of Eved Ivri? What kind of Jewish slave? Jewish slave sold to a Jew or Jewish slave sold to a non-Jew? Isn't it talking about houses in walled cities, which we already spoke about, and an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, sold to Hanimker L'Yisrael, sold to a Jew, and Eved Ivri, Hanimker L'Yisrael, we will go around from here that there should be redemption just like there is by fields, and he could be redeemed by relatives. Says the Gemara, no. Eved Ivri Hanimker L'Ovid Kochavim. It's coming to include a Jewish slave sold to a non-Jew. That he could be redeemed by relatives. Ask the Gemara, that's explicit. It says he explicitly, O Dodo, O Ben Dodo, Yigolenu, his uncle, his cousin, should redeem him. So, top of the next page, this is where Rav Nachman makes a statement, Hahula Kovo Chova. Or maybe it's just from the Brisa, but what the answer is, we're gonna okay. Hahula Kovo Chova. So this is the first step, and then we're not yet up to Rav Nachman. Hahula Kovo Chova. This is to make it an obligation. Meaning the reason why it says it twice when it comes to Jew sold to a non-Jew is in order to make it an obligation. Even according to Rabbi Yoshua, there's going to be an obligation. Rabbi Yoshua had said earlier that when it comes to a field, there's no obligation on the relatives, it's an option. But when it comes to a a Jew sold to a non-Jew, even Rabbi Yeshua agrees that there's an obligation on the relatives to redeem, and that's because otherwise he's going to assimilate. So that everybody agrees to. That's why it says it twice. One is to say he should be redeemed, and one is to make it into an obligation. Okay, fine. Tashma, but we have another brayso. Why does it say he should be redeemed 3 times? It's to teach you that all redemption should be like the redemption of a Jew from a non-Jew. So what's that coming? What's all the redemptions? What's it coming to include? Isn't it coming to include houses in walled cities and a Jewish slave sold to a Jew? And that a Jewish slave sold to a Jew could be redeemed by relatives. And to that, the Brisa says, it's coming to include houses in courtyards in non-walled cities and steyachuza and ancestral fields. That's what it's coming to teach you. That those also could be redeemed like a Jew sold to a non-Jew. That they could also be redeemed by relatives. Ask the Gemara, but it's explicit that you can redeem houses in courtyards and ancestral fields. That's already explicit. So why do I need to learn it from a Jew sold to a non-Jew? So to that, the Gemara says, so where does it say? It says, that the house should be like the field, and they could be redeemed by relatives. So we already know that houses in non-walled cities and ancestral fields could be redeemed by relatives. So why do I need to learn them from the Jew who sold to a non-Jew? So that's where Rav Nachman came along. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, lekarav karav kodem. Where I learned from there, I need another place. I need to learn it again to add this additional point, which is karav karav kodem, that the relatives come first, and that the closer relatives come first. The reason why, what I pick up from, in addition to what I already knew about fields and houses, that they could be redeemed by relatives, what I learned from the Eved Ivri Hanimkar Oved Kochavim, the Jewish slave who sold to a non-Jew, what I learn additionally now is the order, that the Karov should be Karov Kodem, that the closest relative should be first to redeem, and if they can't, so then the next relatives comes next. And we leave off here with sort of still this, it's somewhat open-ended, this last question that we were dealing with, which was, can a relative redeem, well, 2 questions, I guess. Can a relative redeem a Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave sold to a Jew? Can a relative redeem a house in a walled city? Rav Sheshes originally said no to that question about the house in the walled city. We have questions on him, and this last question is also left somewhat open-ended.